In this podcast, we will be discussing how to write an introduction to your academic essay. When writing an introduction, I generally wish to include three main things. Number one, relevant information on the topic. Number two, an expression of my position on the topic. This is usually referred to as a thesis. And the third thing, an outline of the structure of the essay. I have found that while I present information in this order, when I'm actually writing my introduction, I tend to start with the thesis or the middle part of the introduction and then work around it. So for the purpose of this podcast, I'm going to use information from my previous writing plan that I discussed in the previous podcast. So for my research on the role of school boards, I arrived at this thesis, that it is important to understand how school boards work because as elected members of the community, school board trustees provide a democratic presence to the management of schools. So this was the main idea that emerged from my study on policy documents, news articles, and academic research. It is a good strategy to refer to the evidence you have used to inform your thesis. So I would then modify my thesis to look like this. An analysis of policy documents and literature on school board activities demonstrates the importance of the role of school board trustees in the democratic governance of public schools. So you will notice that as I add information, I also edit the wording to improve the expression of my ideas. The next thing I want to do is show the reader how I'm going to organize the evidence that I am presenting. So I will outline the main themes of each paragraph and show how it connects to my thesis. To prepare this section of my introduction, I first write a sentence summary of each point I make in each section of my essay. So for section 1, the main point is school boards are in charge of determining how to enact legislation. The second section, the main point is school boards are in charge of protecting students' rights and freedoms. And section 3, school boards hire teachers and principals to provide a check on their powers. Once I have written my one-sentence summary, I then check to see that they have a strong connection with the thesis. In this case, each sentence refers to something that is expected from democratic work, whether it be enacting legislation, protecting rights and freedoms, or providing a check on the exercise of power. Now, I don't always get lucky, and sometimes I have to go back to my plan and modify my points on the thesis to better illustrate that connection between the thesis and the supporting points. But once I am satisfied with the summaries and I believe they illustrate a strong link with my thesis, I will then highlight the key phrases and integrate the phrases into my introduction. So now it reads like this. An analysis of policy documents and literature on school board activities demonstrates the importance of school trustees in enacting legislation, protecting the rights and freedoms of students, and providing a check on the powers of teachers and principals. As elected members of the community, school board trustees provide democratic governance in schools. Now, I brainstorm different ways to introduce my thesis that will give my reader a general understanding of why my topic is important and what information my essay will provide. So I start by jotting down in point form why my topic is important. Now, thinking about why your topic is important to your reader, involves considering who you want your audience to be. Because most of us restrict our education to undergraduate studies, our professors tend to be the main audience of our papers. When you write, my advice to you is to consider who can best benefit from the information you have studied. In this case, I believe all educators can benefit from this information, especially teacher candidates who are studying to become educators in Ontario. And because these podcasts are made for you, I want you to be my audience. And so if you look at the final point I make, that as future educators, it is important for you to consider learning about the role of school boards and consider running for these positions, that point was made with you in mind. Now, I don't use every point that I jot down. I don't even use the strongest points necessarily. The reason why is because some of these points I will save for the conclusion. So I focus on selecting one or two of my main ideas that will provide a good preface before introducing my thesis. So here's how it looks once I have made my decision on what information to use. While most Ontarians can name their Prime Minister, their Premier, and their Mayor, few Ontarians can name their school board trustees. As elected officials, school board trustees have a significant impact on how schools are managed. School boards have the potential to be spaces for transformation and change when citizens are engaged in the governance of school boards. Future educators who are committed to democratic practice and advocacy work would be wise to study the role of school boards and consider running for these positions. An analysis of policy documents and literature on school board activities demonstrates the importance of school trustees' role in enacting legislation, protecting the rights and freedoms of students, and providing a check on the powers of teachers and principals. As elected members of the community, school board trustees provide a democratic presence to the management of schools, and every educator should be cognizant of their role in public education. So that, in a nutshell, is how I write an introduction. I hope you found this podcast helpful, and I encourage you to stay tuned for the next podcast on how to write supporting paragraph.